Hello and welcome to today's episode of Spec Stepping, where we are stepping through the API, Spec 1 API at a time. In today's episode, we're going to cover the File API. Now, this API is a very powerful API, but you should also understand, just as a disclaimer, this API is related to some other APIs that I'm going to cover in other videos. So, for example, you're going to see when I go through my demo, I'm going to use this file reader object and things like that. So there are some other APIs that it's related to. So there's a whole bunch of file and directory entries APIs, the file system API and all that. So I'll cover those and probably in some other videos. But for right now, I just want to cover the file API and what you can do within the file API. Now, I'll let you, just like in other videos, read through this. It'd be boring for me to read through this and have an example. I have a demo waiting for you, but just a couple things I want to point out before I show you my demo and the code. One is that, first of all, let me back up a step. What this allows us to do is we can provide an interface where we can have the end user upload or provide a file. We do that all the time in applications as users, where you click a button and choose a file to upload it, or you drag and drop to upload a file to some sort of app or service. Now, what this API allows us to do is, as a part of that process, we can access some of the information uh, that's related to those files, the meta information for that files, and even do some cool stuff, especially with their images with those files, that will provide a better, robust interface and provide smarter ways to upload. You have probably experienced this as a user when you've uploaded and seen some of the things I'm going to show you through this. But this is a really cool way that we can access some things even before we go through the upload process. This is all within the browser that we can access this. Now, the other thing that you might want to do is do some sort of validation if this is through a form where you're having them upload images and stuff. I'm not going to go through any of the validation piece of it because that's really another topic, but I would recommend doing that with any time you get information from an end user. You don't want to just blindly trust the end user to not be malicious with your code. Now, a couple things I want to point out. We're going to use the file reader, which allows us to access that. But I wanted to specifically point out this file list. So when we upload files and things, basically, we're going to be accessing this file list. Now, I'm only going to upload one at a time, but you can't do multiples at a time, things like that. But this file list object, it is array-like, but it is not truly an array. So there are some gotchas there just to be aware of. You're going to see me uh, do some array-like stuff with it, but it's not really an array. It's probably similar if you know about nodeless, when you grab the DOM and you can grab nodes and you can kind of for each through them. A node list is not really an array, but it can act array-like. So just a little bit of a gotcha there. So let me just show you the demo. Okay, so I just have a simple demo here. I've got a typical things that we'd see where we'd choose a file, we drag and drop, and then I just have placed on the screen here where I'm going to show you how it's going to output that information to the screen. I'm going to read the files within the browser using the code and output that information. Now, the two files, I've actually got two files I'm going to upload. One is a JSON file, which is user data. It's just dummy user data. And then I also have an image. That one is a really cool one. You see what is going to be capable with that. So I can either drag and drop, excuse me, or I can just choose file. So if I do the user data one, I'm going to do the choose file with user data. So I'm just going to choose that one, click open. It reads it. It gives me the metadata of the name, the size, what type of file, that sort of thing. And it gives me a little bit of a preview. I think I have this set to 200, the first 200 characters of the file. It gives me a preview of the file. And that's kind of handy if you are in your application, you're allowing users to upload files that they can use in your application just so they can get a preview. Oh, I've uploaded the right file and that's what I want, that sort of thing. Now, let me just refresh the screen. And this time I'm going to do the drag and drop, but I'm going to do it with the image. This is a pretty cool feature of this. So if I drag and drop the image over there, it gives me the file metadata. And what this does is it actually does a preview of the image. So if I open that file, that JPEG file, it's just an image of just some icons and stuff that I'm using. So nothing fancy there, but it gives me a little thumbnail preview, which is a pretty cool feature if your application allows users to upload images so they can see, I can see that before I actually do the upload process. This is all taking place within the browser. So pretty cool. So let me jump to the code now and we'll walk through what it does. Now, the HTML is pretty blah. It's just basic HTML. I've got a button I can use. I've got a drag and drop area, and there are some gotchas there that I'll point out in my code. And then I've got the main area we were looking at that shows the information from the file that we read using the file API. And then CSS is just main style stuff, nothing fancy necessarily. Although this one, need to make sure you keep an eye on this one because I'm going to use that for that thumbnail preview. So it for the size of the thumbnail. Oh, the other thing to keep in mind is some of the hover stuff, like the drop zone hover, where I'm changing the transparency and things like that to give it some visual cues. So, for example, if you notice, if I hover, see how it does that visual cue. So that's probably a good thing to do stuff like that. You may have different styles for it, but just to give some visual feedback. So nothing really fancy, just using a pseudo class. So let's jump into the code itself. So first of all, I'm grabbing all my pieces of the HTML DOM, the input, the file count, drop zone, the output, the preview container, all that stuff. And then I have a helper function where I'm just formatting a file size. Instead of this, when the computer looks at the size of the file, it's just going to be this long number that's, not really user friendly from a human standpoint. So what I'm doing is I'm basically using some of the math functions to make it more readable to the end user. So I'm just formatting basically the file size. So if I go back to here and let me just drag the user data over. So the file size, 432 bytes. That's the area that I'm basically using that. So now let me jump back to the code. This core function is what actually does the handling, but I'm going to come back to that. Have this log metadata, which is called, I have two functions. I basically extracted, rather than making one long function, I'm extracting some of the code out into their own functions. So I have this log metadata, which provides this area right here, the file metadata. I'm grabbing the file name, the file type, the size, and I'm formatting it with that helper function that I showed you just a moment ago. And then I'm just grabbing the date last modified. So it creates the name, the type, the size, last date modified. So now if I go back to my handle files, what this does is it passes through the files object. I'm clearing out the text content. I'm clearing out this area, zeroing it out. Actually the output of the text content, and the preview container is actually this area, but the output text content, that is, if we look here, where's my output? Right here, waiting for this pre area. Sorry, I just wasn't right in front of my face, wasn't seeing it. So this area in here is the output, but this entire area is the output area. The preview container is right below it. So I'm clearing the output content, that's just text, so I'm clearing that. I'm using this more modern method here for the container because in just a side note, you might come across some code that uses inner HTML, which you can pass HTML to it. I wouldn't recommend using that. I don't think it's officially a part of the spec, but it is not really secure. You can do some things to violate security when doing inner HTML. So it's better to use text nodes and all that stuff. So I'm replacing all the children, which basically clears everything in the preview. And then here, the file count span, I'm just basically getting the length of how many files we're passing through. I'm only doing one at a time, but you could do multiples and do it this way. Now, here is where I mentioned earlier where the files list is array like. So I'm basically using an array method, the for each, to go over it because I can have access to that. So I'm making an array from my files list and I'm looping over each one. And here is where I'm logging the metadata. Now, the next let me go down to handle files. So I'm listening to this handle files. I'm listening to it in several spots. So I'm listening to it anytime the file input changes. I'm listening to it for drag and drops, and I'm listening to it for um, drag over, drag away, drag hover, and drag leave. So I'm listening to it in several spots for the button and for dragging, dropping, all that stuff. Now, let me just talk about I'm going to come back to the reading because that's really the cool stuff where it reads the file and stuff. I'm going to do that last. But here, the button's pretty straightforward. You just, click the button, change it, and it changes the files. But this drag and drop, for the drag over, drag leave, and drop, there are a couple gotchas you got to be careful of. So if you are dragging like an image, for example, to a browser, and you don't have this prevent default, what it's going to do is it's going to assume you want to open up the image in the browser. So that's what it will do. Some of you may have experienced that in an application where you're trying to drag and drop something and it just opens it up in a tab or in the browser. I've experienced that. That's the default behavior. What we want to do is we want to prevent, excuse me, that default behavior on drag over and on drop. So I got a little note up there talking about that. So that's the first thing we're going to do. We want to prevent that default behavior. So the drag over, that's all I'm doing. And I'm changing that class. I'm adding that CSS that does that blue visual cue for the end user. And then I'm removing that if I leave. So that's just a visual cue that I'm doing for that. But the drop is where I'll remove that hover. So because I've dropped it, I don't need that visual cue anymore. And here's where I'm grabbing that from that data transfer, those files. And then as long as it's greater than 0, so a file actually was dropped, then I'm calling the handle files. Okay, so either way, I'm calling it from the button or I'm calling it from the drop action. So now the read file content is where a lot of the cool stuff happens, where you get this stuff all down here, this preview, or let me just drop over the computer files, or you get the image preview. So let's walk through that code. So I'm grabbing that file reader method, that object, and I'm basically reading the file. So the file that gets passed to my read file content, I'm reading it with using the file reader. But before I actually read it, I'm setting up these listeners because I want to have these in place so that when I read the file, I actually can make some decisions based off that file. Because down here is where the reading actually takes place. So let me just jump down here for a second. So if the file type starts with an image, so if it's an image file, then I'm using the read as data URL. That's a method within the file reader object. And otherwise, I'm reading it as text. So for a text file, you could do this like I have note there. I'm using JSON. You could use a straight text or you could use a CSV, what have you. But for images, I'm using read as data URL, which will more properly handle blob stuff. So when the reading actually happens, though, I have some handlers set up here. So first thing I do is when the reader loads, I'm making sure that I attach the result, whatever I'm targeting, the file, into my result constant here. Okay. And then if the file type starts with an image, so any image, the file type will start with image slash. So if it is, then I'm creating on the fly an image element, an IMG tag. Then I'm taking the source of that and making it the actual result. So if you were to console log this event, you would see there's a bunch of properties and methods and all that stuff tied to event, but the result property of the event target property is what we want that will have the information that we need to put in the source information. So then I'm adding that CSS preview thumb class. So I get the size of the thumbnail and everything, the stylistically that I want. And then I'm just appending it just to my preview container. And then here I just have static text. I'm just outputting to the text content. That way, when I do it, it just says image preview generated. And here is the actual image thumbnail that I'm attaching. Okay. Now, if it's not an image, then I'm making sure, okay, is it a text file or the file type is JSON? Okay, if it is, one of the things I'm doing is I'm concerned about the length of that text. It could be a lot, and I don't want to have a poor user experience. So I'm just saying, okay, take the result of the length, and if it's greater than 200, just grab the first 200 characters and then append the three dots. Oops, sorry, I keep opening my dictionary there with my mouse. Apologies for that. So otherwise, I'm taking my substring and attaching three dots for an ellipse to say that it continues. Or if it's less than 200, just paste the entire contents. Okay. And then add that to content preview. So if I go back to here, just drag this user data is greater than 200. So content preview, there's the three dots at the end of the word zip code, which I think is zip code. And then if there's any error, then I'm throwing an error message right here and putting it on the console and on the screen itself. Again, you've probably heard me say this in other videos. If you have any errors, I would probably do a few things with them. I would handle it elegantly as possible for the end user so that they don't say a lot of geek speak. They know what's happening. I'd probably also log it to a database somewhere so that we can review it as the company, as developers. And I maybe even would also send maybe an alert or something to somebody like via email or some sort of trigger to somewhere to support to help that. So just a couple things you'd want to do. I probably wouldn't just dump it to the console and not ever have it go anywhere. And then here is just where the actual trigger happens. So that's it. I mean, it's 108, even with spaces, 118 lines of code. So this file API is pretty handy if you're doing some interactions with end users, uploading files to your application. It allows you to provide some pretty good functionality. So if you have any questions on that, let me know. If not,